Hi guys, we're back. I'm here. I'm actually here, and this is actually the first day of school. You can see this mask I got, hanging from my headphones here that I have to wear when anybody walks in the room. But I'm here to give you another lecture. I know there's been a lot this week, but there's really no other way around it. We need to push through these documents, get them done, so we can understand them, and get to the real history. So we just got done talking about the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And after the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, I wanted to touch upon, one, the Articles of Confederation. You may remember that I told you that our first government was under the Articles of the Confederation, and it failed. So I'm briefly going to touch upon why it failed. It failed for a number of reasons. I'm going to touch on the big ones. Then I'm going to talk to you about the Constitutional Convention. And you're like, well, what's the Constitutional Convention? Well, in 1788, 1789, the Constitutional Convention took place. And in the Constitutional Convention, they realized that they needed to change our government. That they either needed to form a new government or fix the Articles of Confederation. Because the Articles of Confederation were terrible. Absolutely abysmal. I mean, they were no good, and I can't wait to tell you why, because I love ripping on me some of the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to take a moment, and we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about how the Constitutional Convention decided on the government that we have, that became the document we know as the Constitution, which will be what we talk about after this lecture, the Constitution itself. But at the Constitutional Convention, they end up writing our government that we still have today under the Constitution. We're going to talk about how they came to some of the decisions that they did and some of the problems that they had at the convention. So first, let's get started on the articles here really quick. Minimize my screen. So really briefly, the Articles of Confederation were our first government. It included a unicameral or single-chamber legislature, meaning it only was one house. It had executive leaders who were chosen from this legislature. When the legislature was not in session, the government was run by a committee of 13 delegates, one from each state. There was no federal court system, and Congress settled disputes among the states. Each state selected its own representative and paid them and could recall them at any time. Although the Articles gave Congress some power, they created an ineffective national government. I mean, it was weak. It didn't have enough power. And the states had no intention of giving up its sovereignty to a central government. You have to remember, we fought the Revolution to get rid of the strong government of King George III. And when we created our first government, we kind of overdid it on not having government power. And so the Articles had serious weaknesses. First, Congress didn't have the power to levy taxes. It could only raise money by borrowing or requesting from the states. And you can imagine how that went. Virginia, would you please allow us to tax you? And Virginia was like, no. And it pretty much went that way. They couldn't tax or raise money. They were broke, and they just fought a huge war, and they needed to pay back debts, and they needed to pay pensions to veterans, and they had no money because the states simply refused the tax every time. I mean, you would too if you could. Secondly, Congress didn't have any power to regulate trade. States were controlling trade on their own, and there were 13 different trade plans, essentially, for our nation. And economic disputes rose between the states as a result. It made it difficult for the country to regulate trade and establish good business ties with the world. And third, Congress couldn't enforce anyone to obey laws that it passed. I mean, a government that cannot enforce the laws is no government. I mean, it could pass a law and it politely requested the states to follow it. But again, just like the taxes, the states could say no. They could say no. Also, laws needed to be approved by 9 of the 13 states. That's a lot of the states. And usually only 9 or 10 were present at any one time. Made passing laws impossible. Now we have a government that can't even pass laws. Sounds familiar to our modern government sometimes. Anyways. Fifth, amending or changing the Articles required all states to agree. So in order to change the terrible Articles of Confederation, they all had to agree. How many? I'd like you to gather your 13 closest friends and find me one thing that all 13 agree on. It's going to be tough. So essentially, they couldn't change the government, and it stinks. So that's why in 1787, all right, they had to have the Constitutional Convention. All right. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, they originally met to simply amend the Articles. But once they got there, they realized the Articles was so bad that they needed to create a new government. So it's hard to believe and understand how our early political leaders could craft a constitution. They had no existent documents to work with. They were doing something totally new in the world. I mean, democracies and republics were long thought to not work. In a situation such as this, what challenges would a government face when creating something from scratch? Are they all necessarily going to agree on the same things? The answer is no. And the delegates had a lot of practical experience, political experience. 7 had served as governors of their states, 39 had served in Congress, many helped write their state constitutions, 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence itself, and 6 are terrible government under the Articles. Several good men stood out as leaders. 2 of the more famous ones are George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Ben here with my little arrow, Washington here. Woo, more pictures. James Madison was the greatest delegate, though. He's often referred to as the father of the Constitution, and rightly so. James Madison ended up writing most of the Virginia Plan, which would in large part be adopted as our government. Of course, James Madison also became President of the United States. And fun fact, he is your shortest president ever at 5'2", 100 pounds. The convention chose George Washington to preside over the meetings. All knew that whatever government they might create would most likely select George Washington as its first leader. It also decided that each state would have 1 vote on all issues. A simple majority of these votes would make all the decisions. Although the delegates, as I said, came together to revise their articles, they quickly realized that they needed to start over. The articles were just too terrible. They believed the power of the national government should be divided into 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. They all believed it was necessary to limit the power of the states to coin money and interfere with creditors' rights. They all agreed they should strengthen national government, but the great debate was to how to do all these things. After the rules were adopted, the convention opened with a surprise. It came from the Virginia delegation. And the Virginia delegation made a proposal known as the Virginia Plan, obviously. And it really contained 3 principles. 1, that our next government would contain a strong national legislature with 2 chambers. The lower one to be chosen by the people, and the upper to be chosen by the lower chamber. The legislature would have the power to bar any state laws it found unconstitutional. A strong national executive is to be chosen by the national legislature. 3, a strong national judiciary is to be appointed by the legislature. For those of you that don't know, when it says divide our legislature into 2 parts, this is the current United States Capitol. You will notice that it has 2 sections, one over here and another over here. The first house is the House of Representatives, which is 435 elected members. The second house over here, the Senate, has 100 elected members. In a 2-house legislature, funny word, which is what this is, both houses vote on laws proposed in order to pass them. The introduction of the Virginia Plan was a brilliant move on the part of American nationalists. Borrowing a complete plan from the beginning, they set the direction and agenda for the rest of the convention. Eventually, after much discussion, some modifications to the Virginia Plan became the basis for the new Constitution. Although the smaller states soon realized that the larger, more populous states would be in control of a strong national government. The smaller states wanted a less powerful government with more independence for the states. Overview of the Virginia Plan. So they make a plan known as the New Jersey Plan. which, unlike a two-house legislature, like I just explained, was a one-house legislature with one vote for each state. Congress, however, would be strengthened by giving it the power to tax the states, regulate the trade, and there would be a weak executive that constituted more than one person, not an individual like it became. And finally, there would also be a weak national judiciary. So really, it was the Articles of Confederation revised. Patterson argued that the convention should not deprive the smaller states of the equality they had under the Articles. Thus, this plan was designed for amending the Articles of Confederation. The central government was to continue as a confederation of separate states. After some discussion, the New Jersey plan was rejected. The delegates returned to considering the Virginia plan. Some things to consider. Do you agree, at this point in the lecture, do you agree with the Virginia plan or the New Jersey plan? Does the Virginia plan favor large states over smaller states? As the summer grew hotter and the people's body odor grew worse, because this is before regular bathing, soon the convention was deadlocked over the question of state representation in Congress. Should the states be represented on the base of population, which would benefit the larger states, or should they be represented equally, which would help them make more equality with the smaller states? The debate was bitterly divided, and the convention almost broke up, and our country almost collapsed. Finally, a special committee was proposed to make the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. The compromise suggested the legislative branch have two parts, two houses, bicameral, a House of Representatives based on a state's population the membership would be elected to, and a Senate with 2 members from each state, regardless of size or population. And these state senators would be chosen by state governments. The larger advantage would have the House, and smaller states would be protected in the Senate. Thus solving the problem. However, there was more to debate. Another issue was how to count slaves. Controversial topic in American history even back then. Most people at the Constitutional Convention hated slavery. Unfortunately, though, they knew that they could never get the southern states to agree to a constitution that didn't protect some parts of slavery. One of the things that rose up was whether or not to count slaves in as a full person in the total population count. Obviously, this would have given southern states an advantage in the House of Representatives, as we just discussed. And so, there raged a debate on whether or not to count slaves as a full person. Southerners wanted them counted as a full person so that they could have more control over government. Northerners didn't want them counted at all. The compromise actually settled the issue, sort of meeting halfway. They decided to count all enslaved people for both tax purposes and representation as 3/5 of a person, thus avoiding more deadlock at the Constitutional Convention. However, though, Southerners were forced to agree to outlaw the slave trade. And they agreed to outlaw it in the year 1808. The word slavery is actually never used in the Constitution. However, they used fancy language such as all other persons. And there's also the fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. That is all I think you need to know going forward for when we talk about the Constitution tomorrow. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Have a great day. Oh, also, make sure you complete the small Schoology assignment that's associated with this lecture. Thank you.